To order, bienvenue à la réunion numéro 8 du Comité permanent des pêches et des
Welcome to meeting number 8 of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans.
on unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and express gratitude that we're able to do the important work of this committee on lands they've stewarded since time immemorial. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting to commence its study on the review of the Fisheries Act. Work on this important matter was started in the 44th Parliament, and as you know, the committee has agreed to bring forward the testimonies and submissions from last year and to continue hearing witnesses for at least 5 additional meetings. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule sur
Today's meeting will take place in hybrid format in accordance with the standing orders. Members can take part in person or through Zoom.
Before we begin, I would like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. You'll also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. Pursuant to our routine motions, I would like to advise committee members that all witnesses appearing virtually today have successfully completed the required technical testing. And I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And for those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. En ce qui concerne l'interprétation, pour ceux qui...
If you wish to use a simultaneous interpretation, you have a choice on Zoom to choose between the floor, English or French. The icon is at the bottom of your screen. In the room, you can choose the channel you wish.
Pour les députés présents dans la salle, et tout le monde c'est dans la salle, si vous souhaitez...
If you wish to speak and are in the room, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will do our best to maintain the speaking order, and we thank you for your patience.
Go to our witnesses. Monsieur Desjeunes, I understand you have something you'd like to raise quickly with the committee.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je veux soulever une question.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to raise a question of privilege. At our last meeting on Tuesday, one of the witnesses, I believe, misled the committee. I was asking specific questions, and the answer was incorrect. So I would like to submit the question of privilege at the first opportunity, and I hope that we will deal with it. Thank you, Mr. Deschênes. I know we have spoken about this, and we will deal with this when we are no longer in public.
Welcome our witnesses. We have Andrew Campbell, counsel from the firm Cox & Palmer. Joining by video conference in the room, we have Alistair O'Reilly, Executive Director, and Gary Best, Board Member from the Northern Coalition Corporation. Et aussi par vidéoconférence.
By video conference, Normand Deraspe, Vice President of the Rassemblement des pêcheurs et pêcheuses des côtes des îles.
We'll start with opening statements of the witnesses for 5 minutes or less, beginning with Mr. Campbell. The floor is yours.
Hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the Standing Committee for allowing me to speak today to this committee about some inconsistencies and ambiguities relating to legislative changes to the inshore fisheries regulations on April 21st, 2021. And the fact that the legislative changes deny fishers the full benefit, privileges, and corporate structures that were intended under the legislative amendments. And I have encountered these in dealings with the Atlantic Fisheries and Maritime Fisheries regulations. My name is Andrew Campbell, as you stated. I'm a lawyer with Cox & Palmer and practice law in the rural Prince Edward Island, in the western part of PEI. My areas of practice are mainly real estate, corporate commercial, wills and estates, and of course fisheries. I have requested individual fishers, local fishing groups, buyers, and I've represented all of them and have gained a good appreciation and understanding of the fisheries in the Maritimes. I began doing fisheries matters 34 years ago when a good friend of mine bought a fishing fleet. And I grew up with fishermen all my life, played hockey with them, and many of them are good friends. I was part of the panel regarding changes to the inshore fishery regulations in 2021 and 2020 regarding the changes that were made on April 21st, 2021. These regulatory amendments were made to strengthen and better protect the independence of the inshore fisheries and bring into force many of the policies, i.e. owner-operator and independent core fishers, new entrants into the Atlantic fisheries regulations and maritime provinces fishing regulations. It also recognized the importance of inshore fisheries in our rural communities and the benefits received by family members from fishing, and certainly corporate structures being used by fishers and other corporate structures that should be available to fishers like any other professional organization. The regulations created a new eligible criteria known as the Inshore Family Fishing Corporation, IFFC, to recognize the importance of families who contribute to the fishing enterprise and allow fishers the same corporate structures as other professional groups, such as lawyers like myself. To outline what the Inshore Family Fishing Corporation, DFO, emphasized the criteria, and I submitted a pamphlet, the Inshore Regulations Implementation Guidance on Corporate Structures, written by DFO, that outlined the criteria as follows: that inshore licenses must be issued in the name of an independent core harvestor or in the name of a wholly owned corporation. 2, the license holder must own all voting shares issued by the company. The license holder must be the only director or trustee of an inshore family trust, and the only individuals who can be part of an inshore family fishing corporation are family members, and they can only own non-voting shares. Non-voting shares can only be issued to family members as defined in Section 251(2) of the Income Tax Act, and the individuals who qualify are set out in the pamphlet by DFO, which are mainly spouses, children, brothers, sisters, common law spouses. DFO has also brought out new forms which continuously change. I think they've changed no less than 10 times in the last 4 years. I've included one of those questionnaires as well. These forms identify the independent core fisher, the operator of the vessel being used in fishing. It also requests information on the shareholders of the corporation, the director, family members who have shares. There is full and absolute disclosure to DFO when dealing with inshore family fishing corporations. And all this information is also posted on the local, provincial, or federal websites when you're dealing with Business Corporations Acts. The issue that has arisen in relation to the Act is Section 19(1) of the Atlantic Fisheries Regulations. It's stating, and DFO has continually stated, that license can only be issued to an individual fisher or a wholly owned corporation by the fisher. It does not allow a license to be issued to an inshore family fishing corporation, which I would submit was the true intent of the legislation, and this was an oversight during the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up, and there will be more time for to go deeper in questions from members.
Sure. So my point is that adding the words "in approved inshore fishing family corporations" to 19(1) and 29(2) of the Maritime Fishing Regulations would give fishers the full and absolute benefit of the legislative amendments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. Next, we will be going to Mr. O'Reilly. You'll have the floor for opening remarks for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present the Northern Coalition's proposed amendments to the Fisheries Act. My name is Alistair O'Reilly, Executive Director, Northern Coalition. I'm joined by Mr. Gary Best, who is the CEO of the Nunavut Group of Companies and one of our board members. The members of the coalition are based in Nunavut, Nunavik, Nunatsiavut, and Southern Labrador. So I hope you have an opportunity to view the member listing and perhaps the websites that I've provided. All members are Indigenous, community-based organizations. These firms have been engaged in the northern shrimp and Greenland halibut fisheries since Canada declared the 200-mile exclusive economic zone in 1977. So for almost 50 years, these companies have successfully engaged in these fisheries, generating substantial profits that have been reinvested in infrastructure, economic diversification, and community services. Collectively, roughly 40,000 residents in 52 coastal communities share in the surplus revenues and associated benefits of these fisheries, which currently approximate $50 million annually. Our member firms and the communities they represent are firmly committed to achieving an equitable share of the fisheries resources in their adjacent waters. This would be NAFO areas 0 and 2. At present, less than 50% of the northern shrimp resource is for the benefit of the North. For Greenland halibut, Northerners' share is about 2/3. However, there are some significant imbalances. For example, while 70% of the 2+3K Greenland halibut quota is harvested off Labrador, only 10 or 15% of this resource is harvested by Labrador-based vessels. Similarly, the recent reopening of northern cod provides all quota holders in Labrador, in NAFO Area 2J, with 22% of the available quota, even though over 50% of the resource, of the biomass, is located off Labrador. So throughout all southern coastal regions of Canada, fishery resources are primarily for the benefit of those who live adjacent to these resources. In accordance with Canada's Northern and Arctic policy, Indigenous reconciliation policy, and most importantly, Canada's long-standing fisheries access and allocation policies, Northerners should receive access to adjacent resources to a comparable degree as licensed and quota holders in Canada's other marine regions. We provided a few key references to the stated, but not always applied, access and allocation policies of the Department. Your committee recently heard DFO's Senior Director of Resource Management, Mr. Todd Williams, described the vague art of applying adjacency, historic dependence, and economic benefits as considerations in decision-making. You've also heard from witnesses that to the extent to which these principles are applied isn't evident. Amazingly, there currently is no requirement for ministers to even consider these principles or report on their application. So our board is concerned with references that arise within DFO and in the industry to concepts of willing buyer, willing seller, and stability of access. Because, as defined, these concepts would entrench existing allocation keys, remove the minister's discretion in access and allocation decision-making, and, in effect, cause Canada's common property fishery resources to be treated as permanent property rights. Access and allocations should be based on a predictable, coherent, and consistent policy framework that offers a reasonable period of assured access, but also enables the minister to optimize the public good when responding to substantive socioeconomic and ecosystem shifts. Accordingly, we recommend that Section 2.5 of the Act be amended to require the cornerstone principles of adjacency, historic dependency, and economic benefits to be incorporated as mandatory legislative considerations in all access and allocation decisions, and that the minister must report how these principles have been applied. These amendments would improve consistency, predictability, transparency, and accountability in access and allocation decision-making without fettering the minister's discretion. We note that these proposed amendments are consistent with the 2019 amendments to the fish stock provisions of the Act, which require ministerial actions and responses to sustainability risks. Thank you for your attention. We welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Reilly. Prochainement, nous allons maintenant entendre.
We will now be hearing Mr. Normand Desraspes for 5 minutes or less. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Normand Deraspe. I've been a fisherman for 30 years, and I've held a commercial lobster fishing license in Zone 22 near the Magdalen Islands in Quebec for almost 20 years. As Vice President of the Rassemblement des Pêcheurs et Pêcheuses des Côtes des Îles, the RPPCI, and on my own behalf, I'd like to thank you, and on behalf of 200 and more fishers out of 325, thank you for inviting us today to share our views on the Fisheries Act in Canada. This is a first, I believe. Here are some issues and recommendations for commercial fishing. Regional equity issues in fisheries management. Over the years, commercial fishers have observed that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the FO, does not apply laws and regulations uniformly across regions. This perception of inequity is reflected in several aspects of license management and fishing regulations. For example, the price of a commercial fishing license varies depending on the regions, though fishers in the Gaspé and the Magdalen Islands are engaged in the same activity. Cost of licenses still differ. These are two regions in Quebec. This disparity creates a sense of injustice among the Magdalen Islands fishing community. Furthermore, enforcement of DFO regulations is perceived as varying from one region to another. For example, the rollout of electronic logbooks is not uniform across Canada. And cod fishing, which is permitted in Newfoundland in the autumn, remains prohibited in Quebec during the same period, and that heightens the sense of unfairness among Quebec fishers. To remedy the situation, DFO should standardize its regulations and ensure that its own departmental rules are applied consistently and fairly across all regions of Canada. Reporting lost or recovered gear at sea. First of all, we'd like to draw your attention to DFO's requirements for commercial fishers to report gear lost or recovered at sea. This issue is very important to our community because it directly affects our practices and responsibilities in terms of sustainable marine resource management, as well as the time spent on this activity. We're asking DFO to be flexible with regard to reporting lost and recovered gear at sea. Specifically, we propose increasing the number of replacement pots allowed on board vessels during the fishing season and extending the period allowed for recovering lost pots. For example, if a fisher loses 8 pots, it should be possible for him to have 8 replacement pots on his vessel during the recovery period. On to the distinction between commercial, recreational, and subsistence fishing. Another issue that concerns us is commercial fishing for recreational purposes. We'd like to stress the importance of clearly distinguishing between those two types of activity and highlighting their implications for commercial fishers in our regions. Over the years, commercial fishers have shown good practice and sound management of commercial fishing. But we're concerned that an imbalance in fish and shellfish stocks could occur if subsistence fishing were to be authorized by the ministry. It would be appropriate for DFO to consider a number of options, like establishing quotas for commercial fishers and extending the fishing season into the autumn for cod for subsistence or recreational fishing. Coexistence with right whales and adaptation of fishing gear. Coexistence with right whales is also crucial, requiring particular attention to be paid to adapted fishing gear for the fishing area and seabed characteristics. Equipment will need to be modified or adjusted to minimize the risks to right whales. Practices must be adapted to the specific environment in order to promote better coexistence between fishing activities and right whale preservation. To this end, we propose that the DFO adapt regulations according to the area and type of fishing specific to each region. For example, we are in a migration zone where right whales migrate to feeding areas between June and August, and our fishing season runs from April to July. So we are right in the transition zone, and that means Some areas are closed when they don't need to be, and they're also closed for too long. Mr. Deraspe, we're past the time limit. Thank you. The scientific monitoring and climate change, we think it's very important to continue scientific surveys given climate change, which is happening. And financially, we're also asking the DFO to provide support for the Quebec Fisheries Fund, for example, so we can gain a better understanding of our marine environment.
We're going to move into the 6-minute round of questioning, starting with Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to welcome the witnesses here today. We've got a comprehensive submission here from a group of ENGOs that are mostly foreign funded. Most of their funding comes from the United States group, including ENGOs like Oceans North, Oceana, David Suzuki Foundation, Ecology Action Center. The list goes on. The number one recommendation that these groups are putting forward is to have Section 6.1 amended so that all fisheries are managed into the healthy zone. So, to Mr. O'Reilly, you mentioned turbot and northern shrimp. What would be the impact to your harvesters, your coastal communities, of these stocks exclusively being managed into the healthy zone?
Thank you for the question. In the case of Greenland halibut, those stocks are already in the healthy zone, as are the shrimp stocks. Some of the shrimp stocks, you will be familiar with SFA 6 off the northeast coast of the island in southern part of Labrador. That stock was in the critical zone for some time. But fishing was allowed to continue at a modest level during that period, which helped sustain the fishery and maintain operations and learn more about the status of the resource. In the proposal you just referenced, that opportunity would not be there, and it would be very unduly restrictive in terms of being able to operate the fishery and sustain the communities and the people that are dependent on it.
And I understand Area 5 shrimp is not in the healthy zone, and Area 4 as well. They're both in the cautious zone. So what would happen to those fisheries?
No, actually, they are both in the healthy zone. The PA framework is going through actually a fairly significant and rigorous revision. But the new science that's been worked on for the past couple of years has changed the arrangements, the analysis to 2 fishing areas as opposed to the 7 we currently have for assessment purposes. And at present, it is the findings of the science community that both of these regions are in the healthy zone.
Mr. O'Reilly, these groups like Oceana and Oceans North, they've consistently lobbied for the complete closure of forage fisheries. Now, you take a species like mackerel, which is basically, it's not an alpha predator, but it's pretty close, I guess, if it consumes the larvae and the spawn of every other species. What would be the impact of a species like mackerel with its population becoming out of control, which is basically what we're seeing in our areas in Atlantic Canada, as I'm sure you're pretty well aware with your vast knowledge of local ecosystems. What will be the impact on cod, capelin, herring, lobster, mackerel, shrimp, and so on? Because all spawn rises to the top of the water column, and the larvae hatches there, and then mackerel come along in immense quantities and consume that larvae. So what would be the impact of a stock like mackerel just being out of control?
Well, you're right. I mean, that could have significant detrimental effects on a number of species. But you mentioned predator relationships, and shrimp is also a species that is consumed extensively by groundfish. And these ecosystems are, as you all know, are very dynamic, very complicated, and have been highly erratic over time in terms of shifts in biomass. It isn't practical, or we do not have the knowledge base, the expertise, to have arbitrary rules such as closures when we determine that we're in the healthy zone or in the cautious or in the critical zone at any particular point in time. It requires a level of engagement of industry, science, and managers to take prudent and practical decisions. And the description of what you've just outlined would be just arbitrary rules with little or no opportunity for industry engagement.
So this amendment, Mr. O'Reilly, to 6.1 poses a bit of a threat to those who make their livelihoods on the waters. If this goes through, would we see a northern cod fishery right now?
It's difficult to know what the implications would be other than they'd be negative, and that's for certain. In 2019, the amendments to the fish stock provisions attempted to bring into place a situation where the minister either had to act to ensure sustainability or explain why that wasn't being done. It sounds as though the NGO community now are wanting to go further, back to where they hoped to go in 2019, to take away the discretion from the minister and force decisions that are based on oftentimes very weak and inadequate and incomplete analyses.
So I've got just a quick question on the 30 by 30 marine conservation area desires of the federal Liberal government. How would that impact you if it came to full fruition that 30% of the waters that you fish were protected and not accessible to you? Do you agree with the 30 by 30 principle?
Very short answer.
The concept is okay. The practical application of it is challenging. We went through a fairly extensive process in 2017 to get the first 10 to 14% of protected areas. That was relatively straightforward. The next part would be absolutely painful and very restrictive.
Thank you very much, Mr. Small. Next, we'll be going to Mr. Morrissey for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My first question will be to Mr. Campbell, and I would like Mr. Campbell to take you back to, you were referencing Section 19.1 of the Act and the wording around it that could cause problems for inshore fishers. But before I get to respond, could you give an opinion on, do most of the inshore owner-operator fishers arrange their affairs in a similar corporate structure as to the one you articulated?
For the past 5 years, I incorporate all fishers, whether they be existing independent core fishers or new entrants, would be incorporated, and we're seeing more and more of them as senior fishers pass away or do succession planning. These are the corporate structures that they're utilizing in order to do that succession planning to the next generation.
If this ability to structure their affairs in this manner was questioned or removed, will that impact transitions, the transitioning or the movement of licensing from father to son or family members, or to others in the community?
The amendments that I've requested allows a smoother flow of the licenses from father to son, or mother to son, or brother to brother, or among siblings and family. So it would allow a smoother transition and avoid conflict between the Income Tax Act and the Fisheries Act.
Some of the issues surrounding if there was left ambiguity in this act that could be contradicted in the CRA Act.
The proposed amendments would avoid those conflicts and ambiguity that are often caused between the Income Tax Act and the Fisheries Act and the regulations. It makes a smoother transition.
And could you expand a bit when you reference that in the section, or the way DFO is interpreting this section? You indicated that there's been numerous interpretation bulletins from DFO which constantly change. Could you expand a bit on what issues that create for the inshore fisher, the owner-operator that may wish to structure their fishing operations in this manner?
Probably 25 years ago, there was a lot of confrontation or conflict between the income tax and fisheries and incorporations of companies. And that was amended by having the legislation amended to allow wholly owned corporations. And today, what is proposed is the inshore family fishing corporations, which would allow families to better structure their affairs and avoid many of the income tax ramifications that are imposed by CRA, such as bare trusts, declarations of trusts, things like that. The proposed amendments would avoid that ambiguity and allow for distribution of the beneficial interest from the net proceeds of the fishing licenses to family members, as defined in the Income Tax Act.
If a new entrant to the fishery could not arrange their affairs in this manner, would it impede their ability to get financing through commercial entities?
Most of them that we deal with are incorporated, and they are able to seek financing through the local credit union through this structure that we use. But it all comes down to
Mr. Campbell,
core fisher.
Okay, but if they didn't have the ability to structure in the corporate manner that is now common practice, but maybe some ambiguity as it comes to CRA legislation, would that negatively impact their ability to get financing?
Yes, it would negatively impact their ability to get financing.
So because one of the tenets of the Act is the protection of the owner-operator, which was a long sought-after protection by inshore fishers. Is anything that you're proposing that would take away or undermine the principle of owner-operator?
No, it's all within the legislative amendments, and there's nothing that affects the owner-operator or independent core fisher or new entrant.
So just to sum up in my last time, so a simple amendment that you're recommending would remove the possibility of future years of there being some question that would financially negatively impact the inshore fisher if this legislation did not clarify on this particular point. Am I interpreting you correctly?
It would negatively impact the fisher's ability for succession planning and the fisher's ability to obtain financing.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. That has my question on that, so I'm fine, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrissey. Et prochainement, on va à Monsieur Deschênes pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Deschênes, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. First of all, some question for Mr. Deraspe. Good morning. In your presentation, you talked about uniform application of the legislation. You gave some examples on which I'd like more detail. You said that for lobsters, license cost differs depending on whether you're in the Gaspé or in the Magdalen Islands. What is that difference? We pay $800 and so, whereas in the Gaspé it's under $300. In some past years, catches in the Gaspé were much lower than in the Magdalen Islands, and then we had agreed to let them pay a bit less, but now we know that lobster prices have gone up, so we could be paying the same. We're not trying to make things difficult for the Gaspé or raise their cost. We'd like to just have things leveled. You talked about the logbooks. The obligation to have a logbook is in the regulations applying to Magdalen Island rules, but not for others. There was a lot of discussion on this years ago. This is when we formed our group. This was an obligation for us, and we looked at other provinces, and it really is an obligation that's imposed only on the Magdalen Islands. So we've accepted it, sort of, but it's it's not being rolled out uniformly across Canada. And if we're wondering if DFO regulations are fair to everyone. Why is it a problem for Magdalen Island fishers being obliged to use logs and not others? Well, most days the weather's bad and, picking up pencil and paper is difficult. Everything's wet. The waves wet the whole cabin. And you need to keep a log, and that's really not what you're thinking about right there. You're thinking about fishing, catching lobster, and then dealing with paperwork. And it is an obligation. You have to do it before you dock. So it takes time there's time, or not much time rather, between the end of your fishing activity and when you get back to the dock. So really it's difficult to do. The problem is also that other maritime fishers don't have to fill out this logbook. Why do you see that as unfair? Well, why should it be an obligation for us and not for them? We were told by local DFO officials that we had to do it. We did some research and we realized that it wasn't actually an obligation for everyone. It was an obligation for us. Mr. De Raspe, my last point, you talked about the cod fishery, which opened up around Newfoundland. You said that Magdalen Island fishers, there was some difference there. Can you explain? Today we're buying Newfoundland cod. We're fishing pretty much on the same grounds. They come almost as close to us as we go to their shores. They're fishing cod close to our shore, and then we can't fish there. Since we're told that cod stocks are declining, everybody should have to deal with the same restrictions, be it for subsistence or other fishing. If you're subsistence fishing, you can pick up 5 cod, but under other circumstances you can pick up 50. But just for those 5 cod, I've got to do 15 or 20 nautical miles, and I've got to deal with fuel costs and everything else. So it's not really profitable for me to go after 5 cod. So as commercial fishers, if we are entitled to 200 pounds, that's what we'll go get. Or just tell DFO that it's not going to be worth it. We're not just taking out a little boat. It's a large vessel, and it has costs. So what you'd like is when new fishing rights are allocated for cod, you'd like a process that includes all regions contiguous to the new region. Well, we have no access as Magdalen Island commercial fishers. We've no access to this. Thank you, Mr. De Raspe. I have a question for Mr. O'Reilly. You talked about amending Article 2.5 in the Fisheries Act, which establishes a list of criteria that the minister may take into account in decision-making. You believe that article should be amended so that it would state may instead of must. The reverse, so that it would state must or shall instead of may, rather.
For the question, the things that there are a number of considerations in 2.5. They're all high level, very vague. I do not see how they make any benefit to the minister in arriving at any decision. They're of that nature. But what we're proposing is that those core principles of adjacency, historic dependence, and economic benefits, that those be mandatory, that the minister must require them. And explain how they were applied. This does not fetter the minister's authority. The minister may make other decisions, but at least have to consider those core elements and advise how they were applied in each case.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Deschênes.
Thank you, Mr. Deschênes.
Questioning. We'll start the second round with Mr. Arnold. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll turn to Mr. O'Reilly again to further follow up on the previous question from Mr. Deschênes. You mentioned that you'd recommend that the principles of adjacency of access be added to the requirements. Now, I believe I just heard you say that these are things you feel must be done. So the terminology in the legislation that would be that the minister shall consider, not may consider. Is that correct? Okay, and would this mean the criteria that are there would be all as a shall, the minister shall, or should there be different sections of saying what the minister shall consider, and then another, excuse me, another section saying what she may consider?
Essentially, the proposal is that those three elements be mandatory. But on your question, and question, Mr. Deschênes, it really doesn't matter if all the others are shall or may. They are of such a nature that it's really difficult to understand how they will have any influence. They just say you should consider this, you should consider that, but it doesn't. There's no specificity or clarity as to what that actually means. But for the consistency in the legislation, it could be easily shall for everything, just so that there's consistency.
Okay, thank you. And you also mentioned the reasoning or the rationale for a decision. Do you feel there's any transparency in the decision on allocations? We heard recently, and I believe you mentioned it, that the DFO official that was here stated the process of allocation of TAC is more of an art than a science. Do you feel that there is enough transparency in those decisions, or should that also be something that is in the Act, that there's a requirement of disclosure of rationale for decisions?
Yeah, thank you. There is no clarity right now as to how these principles are applied. There's no transparency, there's no reporting. So our request is that they be mandatory, but also that the minister be required to explain how they were applied. And we're being careful here not to propose any fettering of the minister's authority. The minister can still choose to do something other than attend to any of those principles, but they must be considered in our view. And then at least that would offer, and the explanation thereafter would offer greater transparency and accountability and clarity, because it would impose some process on the department and on the minister to identify what those factors are and how they are applied and what weighting is assigned, etc.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn now to Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell, you spoke about the difficulties with the ownership and controlling agreements and so on. Did the changes to the legislation and the regulations that have followed improve the issues that we've heard about at this committee over controlling agreements and owner-operator policy?
I would say they have improved them based on the legislative amendments. The problem with them is just there's an impediment that when I'm mainly consulted with is when a husband or a spouse dies, husband or wife dies, and they have a fishing fleet. It's become very difficult for succession planning to move that license over to a son or daughter, whoever the new entrant is in the family. And that's where we're having the issue. But as far as giving us a regime or structure, I think the legislative amendments did exactly what we requested in 2020. However, there's just a small amendment that is required. I think the problem with what DFO has stated with the structures they're proposing is we're back to bare trust or controlling agreements, declarations of trust, which is the wrong way to go.
If I can just stop you while I've got 10 seconds left here. The changes that have been made on the West Coast, would they have a benefit to, or changes that have been made on the East Coast, would they be a benefit to small harvesters on the West Coast?
Definitely. It's all about income tax, right? You're paying either 15% income tax in a corporation, or you're paying 52% income tax individually. So it would be very beneficial if their income is greater than, say, 50,000. That's a generalization.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Arnold. Next, we'll go to Mr. Connors or Mr. Earl. Welcome to the committee. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My questions this morning will be directed towards Witness Best, and if time permits, Mr. Daraspe. Ula Kut, Gary, Atiliai. I'm being guided by the recommendations in the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, in particular call to action number 92, corporate reconciliation. Coming and representing Labrador, the Nunatsiavut government is in the 20th year of self-government, again guided by the recommendation. I'm wondering if you could talk to this committee about corporate reconciliation and in the context of the Fisheries Act, what you see there that gives you comfort that government is serious about corporate reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and setting quotas that promote and allow economic development in Indigenous communities.
Mr. Earl, thank you, Chair Committee. Thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts this morning. I am a beneficiary of the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement, also a member of Northern Coalition, President CEO of the Nunatsiavut Group of Companies, and coincidentally, National Chair of the Inuit DevCorp Association. So a lot of what we're talking about applies across the north throughout Inuit and Angat. To our area in particular, and I'd like to focus on one alarming sort of point that is not just an irritant, but it upsets a lot of local people along the coast. In shrimp fishing areas 4 and 5 that are adjacent to Nunatsiavut waters, our access is only 32% within that shrimp fishing area 4 and less than 29% for shrimp fishing area 5, notwithstanding 20 years of a land claim agreement. We find that not necessarily of benefit to ourselves. We find that's a very low share of resources adjacent to our coast and frankly, offensive. We have had several, and I do not speak on behalf of the government of Nunatsiavut, even though I'm a beneficiary. There have been many discussions with DFO over the years. And within the Nunatsiavut Group of Companies, we have 9 companies that are wholly owned and majority owned and 10 partnerships. I would say that the most connected company of all is Nuluak, which is our fishing entity. But we don't have enough quota to purchase a vessel to compete with the big players, and that's problematic. And I will say that the benefits, the dividends that we get now, the royalties, we plow that back in growing profitable and sustainable companies in areas that may not be as profitable, such as construction on the coast and other elements where we can support our people socio-economically speaking. So again, while there's talk of reconciliation and the truth and reconciliation in particular, this is a fact where we aren't getting fair access to our resources. And it's certainly something we'd like folks to consider on a go-forward basis, something that's a bit more fair, a bit more just, and to understand the adjacency principle, also the historical dependency as well, because it really allows for increased economic benefits to many of our coastal communities that are still suffering poverty in many respects. Now, thanks.
Et bonjour, Monsieur Normand Desrapes.
Mr. Normand Desrapes, my question to you today
testimony related to fishers from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador fishing near your geographic area. I didn't quite understand that. I'd understand your geographic area to be in NAFO Area 4R, a closed area. Could you expand on your testimony to give us more insights into how Newfoundland and Labrador fishers are harvesting in that perceived to be closed zone? Merci.
Oui, ben, c'est pas vraiment dans nos zones à nous, mais
Well, this isn't really in our area. We go about 100 to 150 miles north, and they do about the same in their own zone. So if they can fish cod in their zone, we should be able to fish for cod close to it.
Second round. On va terminer le deuxième tour avec Monsieur Deschênes pour.
We'll conclude our second round with Mr. Deschênes for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Riley, I'd like to continue my questions on the idea of amending a single word in Section 2.5. It would have a significant impact, however. The minister's discretionary power would have more boundaries. He'd have to take into consideration all the subsections stipulated in 2.5. Does this meet your principal concern, the one you cited, and Mr. Best, the fact that the attribution of new fishing rights, the allocation of new fishing rights, don't always go to coastal fishers living close to the fishing zone in question? You said that in Labrador, you have 10 to 15% of halibut quotas when much is going to fishers from the outside. So do you think these considerations are sufficient to protect coastal fishers, or should we not add another consideration stating that fishers living close to the fishing zone should be given priority?
For the question, I think I like the question, I like the thought, because it depends on how one defines adjacency and historic dependence. How it's been articulated over time would suggest that, in line with your question, is that those living adjacent resource would be the primary beneficiaries, and that's what we seek to achieve. So could it be strengthened in terms of language and be more definitive? Yes, to the extent that that's necessary. I find that you have to strike a balance in terms of a legislative requirement. I mean, the minister can't be completely tied and removed from any discretion in making decisions. So I think in that context, what we propose allows for that, but still accords the priority to adjacency, which ought to, over time, provide fair and equitable access and deal with the issues such as Mr. Best described, where it's 30% instead of what it should be.
Justement, peut-être pour terminer, Monsieur Best, vous...
To conclude, perhaps, Mr. Best, you said you had 22% of shrimp quotas, and that wasn't enough. Of course, you would want more, but on what basis do you say that you should have a higher percentage of the quotas? Thank you.
32% of SFA 4, less than 29 for SFA 5. I think if you were to look across the region, across Atlantic Canada, indeed both coasts, I don't think you'd see that elsewhere. And I think other Indigenous populations have used litigation to make that point known to the Government of Canada. I don't believe the Nunavut government has gone there yet. But it certainly is impinging on our ability to plan for future investments. As I said earlier, I've had many individuals from different regions looking at partnering. Everybody looks at, obviously, a quota or what could be emerging in groundfish, for example. Unless and until we see a fair recognition, if you will, of our rights under the Labrador Inuit Land Claim Agreement, for a more fair and just pathway, I think, to achieving an equitable share of what we consider our natural and adjacent resource, then we're not going to get there, and we will not be in a position to create better and more favorable economic conditions for the people that we serve. Our company is owned by the 7,000 Nunavut beneficiaries. They're my stakeholders and shareholders. So we're obligated to not just operate profitable, sustainable companies. We're looking at, in this particular case, a resource that's been with us, that we've harvested for years and years and years, way before the other foreign fleets. And we're going to be here for millennia. And,
Merci beaucoup. Je dois terminer ici.
Thank you. We have to conclude here.
I want to give an opportunity both to a liberal, or sorry, a conservative and then a liberal to just ask one question for the witnesses before we go to the second panel. I understand, Mr. Gunn, you're next on the list here, so I want to give you that opportunity, and then the same for a Liberal member.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question to Mr. O'Reilly. Do you support the ENGO submission to change Section 6.1 of the Fisheries Act to essentially close Canadian fisheries that aren't in the healthy zone?
We haven't spent a lot of time focusing on that amendment yet, but I'm quite confident to say that we do not agree that ought to be imposed at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I just want to give the same opportunity for a Liberal member just to ask one last question before we move to the next round.
Yeah, so my question is for Mr. O'Reilly. As we look at the Fisheries Act and the changes that are forthcoming, and we look at the newer harvester that will be coming into the fishery, can you talk to us a little bit, drawing on your vast experience, and I know you well, I know you have that, and what that new harvester will look like vis-a-vis what the new Fisheries Acts may look like?
Thank you for the question. We are, like most sectors, we are dealing with a huge demographic challenge in the fishing industry. And we have to provide an industry environment that offers a greater level of sustainability, greater level of confidence and profitability, viability. And we need predictive, we need security, and we need fairness and equity in terms of access. So that's not there in the current legislation, and it creates a volatile, uncertain environment, which is really not conducive to inducing and encouraging youth to participate in the industry and have confidence in their futures.
Thank you very much, Mr. Earl. So that's going to complete our first panel. So I want to thank our witnesses for being here in person and by video conference, and for sharing your testimony. This will be very helpful as we put together our reports and recommendations on the review of the Fisheries Act. But now I'd like to briefly suspend while we welcome our next group of witnesses to the table. before we begin, I just want to make a few comments for the benefit of our new witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. En ce qui concerne l'interprétation,
to listen to simultaneous interpretation, if you are on Zoom, you will see an icon at the bottom of your screen, so you can choose floor English or French. If you're in the room, you can use your audio and the channel selected.
For the second panel, par vidéoconférence, Véronique Chadillon-Farinazzi, professeure Université de Moncton.
We'll be hearing Véronique Chadillon-Farinazzi, Associate Professor at the University of Moncton.
Mr. Jason McClinton, President, and by video conference, and I know it's early, so thank you for participating, Mr. Colin McMillan, Council Chair, Fisheries Council of Canada. And also in person, I'd like to welcome Ms. Kim Elmsey, the Senior Campaign Director for Oceania Canada. So, alors, nous allons commencer.
We'll begin with the opening statements by our witnesses for 5 minutes or less, with Professor Chadillon-Farinazzi. Please go ahead. Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, committee members. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Véronique Chadillon-Farinazzi. I'm an associate professor of criminology at the University of Moncton. Before becoming a professor, I worked in analysis and intelligence in police, a career that has been recognized with a number of awards. I designed and tested real-time analysis tools that help to move difficult investigation forward. Those innovations modernized analysis practices to support investigations, and the experience taught me to identify how to act and what one can do in complex systems. My interest in navigating complex rules led me to an interest in commercial fisheries in the maritime provinces. Fishing structures coastal life and engages fishers and officers in a complex system of rules where everyone can be a target, an offender, or a steward of resources. My research aims to better understand those roles and to propose fairer solutions on the basis of dialogue between communities and authorities. In recent years, I've studied discrepancies in the reporting of lobster-related offences between officers and citizens, internal DFO exchanges on illegal overfishing that led to closure of the 2023 season, and how fishers organize themselves when regulatory authority is either absent or discredited. My current research suggests 2 ways to build trust and improve the system. First recommendation is to create a code of ethics for people in position of authority with significant discretionary power. Fisheries officers have significant powers, but there's no code of ethics binding them, established by an independent entity to regulate their work. An ethical framework would clarify roles and responsibilities, help protect the public in the event of breaches, and support officers in the performance of their duties, and limit the influence of external pressure in developing such a code, and more broadly in managing the conservation and protection program. It's important not to automatically replicate policing approaches which are ill-suited to the specialized circumstances of fisheries officers' work. Resource managers could consider similar guidelines because their discretionary power directly influences how decisions are perceived and can affect public confidence in the system. Second recommendation, clarify the rules, establish an effective reporting mechanism, and adapt penalties. The rules must more effectively reflect realities on the ground. For example, stealing gear during the season can compromise fishermen's activities and contribute to illegal fishing. It is not like stealing a lawnmower. When an offence falls under both the Criminal Code and the Fisheries Act, this can create confusion and leave situations unresolved. In addition, implementing an appropriate reporting mechanism should allow for timely intervention when an offence is in progress or a situation is likely to escalate. A clear distinction between the roles of DFO officers and RCMP officers is also essential to ensure an appropriate response. Lastly, some species attract more crime because of their value or conservation status. The law could recognize a special status for species vulnerable to illegal markets, allowing for the addition of an appropriate penalty comparable to a compensatory surcharge. In conclusion, the Fisheries Act should not only regulate resources but also relationships. Effective legislation depends also on the legitimacy of those who enforce it, the trust of those who live with it, and the clarity of the principles that guide it. Thank you.
Professor,
Thank you, Professor.
go to Mr. McClinton. You have the floor for 5 minutes or less for opening remarks.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci les membres.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to committee members for giving me this opportunity to speak on your review of the Fisheries Act. The CCP and its members estimate that it is not necessary to prioritize amendments to the Fisheries Act for the moment, but rather that the Government of Canada should prioritize the most effective possible use of existing regulatory and political instruments. The CCP is a spokesperson for the Canadian fisheries and shellfish industry. Members of the CCP include small and medium-sized and larger corporations that create jobs and provide an economic foundation to help create other local businesses.
Members do not recommend reopening the Fisheries Act at this time. New legislative and regulatory requirements would add challenges and administrative burden at a time when industry is already working to adapt to numerous challenges, including global market uncertainties and tariffs. The sector doesn't need additional change as it wrestles with these challenges. This includes provisions around fish stock provisions, which allow the Minister of Fisheries to tailor fish stock assessment recommendations specific to each fishery. This also includes the provisions surrounding licensing policy, which currently and correctly are adapted to meet the needs to the unique circumstances of the Pacific. Instead of reopening the Act, FCC and its members recommend that the Government of Canada make the most efficient use of tools, both in regulation and policy, that are already in place to address the most critical issues facing our sector. These issues are the need for stability of access and allocation of Canada's fishing resources, as predictability and stability is key to investment and long-term growth in the fisheries sector, as it is with any sector. 2, the Government of Canada, we are calling on the Government of Canada to work with FCC and its members on marine conservation and take socioeconomic considerations into equal account to avoid the negative and completely avoidable impacts that well-intentioned but misinformed closures have on our sector. And 3, the need for the Government of Canada to conduct robust core fisheries science, which is essential for sustainable fisheries management. There are, of course, other issues facing our sector today, including market access and tariffs, as well as the need to attract skilled labor, often in remote areas. But the issues I have outlined above are most directly linked to the committee and its mandate. In short, FCC and its members do not feel that amendments to the Fisheries Act need to be prioritized at this time, but rather that the Government of Canada prioritize the most efficient use of existing regulatory and policy tools to address the most pressing issues facing the industry today. Thank you once again, and I would be pleased to take your questions. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. McClinton. And then to complete our opening statements, I'll hand the floor over to Mr. or Mrs. Elmsley for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I am the Senior Campaign Director for Oceania in Canada. Our top priority is the rebuilding of healthy fish populations and resilient fisheries. We believe the oceans are essential to help feed the 9 billion people projected to be on Earth by 2050. Oceania wants the same things that a lot of people in this room want: robust, healthy, wild fisheries and all the cultural, economic benefits that come with them. Canada's fish stocks have been severely overfished in past decades, with devastating consequences for communities. Today, only a third of Canada's fish stocks are considered healthy. We are at a turning point in fisheries management in Canada, which, if done well, can restore Canada's depleted fish populations. This can only be done and achieved by a strong Fisheries Act. In 2019, new fish stock provisions created by this committee were added to the Fisheries Act. These new provisions, supported by regulations, required that the minister implement measures to maintain major fish stocks at sustainable levels and to develop and implement rebuilding plans when stocks fell into the critical zone. This historic change brought Canada in line with other leading fish nations, including our biggest trade partners. We're just beginning to see the results. In the last year, 12 rebuilding plans for fish stocks in the critical zone were created and published. That is more than 1/3 of all critical zones. This is proof of what is possible when policy, science, and stakeholder input align. But overall, Canada's fish stocks have stagnated over the past 9 years, as outlined in our fishery audit. Canada is still hovering around only 35% of fish stocks in the healthy zone. The rest are depleted below healthy levels or have an uncertain status. To successfully rebuild fish stocks, the government must fully implement the amendments made in 2019, combined with some additional improvements, to truly set the legal foundation for recovery. Our first recommendation would be to end overfishing by requiring fish stocks to be managed to the healthy zone. This change provides clarity and consistency to fisheries management plans and decisions, bringing us in line with other fishing nations. It is entirely consistent with existing DFO policy and will ensure we get the maximum benefit from stocks without overfishing them to the point of collapse. Without this clarity, Canadian harvesters are missing out on the rewards of rebuilding. Since 2000, using this approach, the United States has rebuilt 50 fish stocks, producing an average of 50% more revenue, as outlined in their report to Congress. Our second recommendation is to ensure that the rebuilding provisions apply to all federally managed fish stocks by setting a firm date to list all stocks. The fish stock provisions of the Fisheries Act apply to major stocks listed under regulation. This was done to allow DFO to better manage their workload. Since 2019, only 30 out of almost 200 major fish stocks have been added. This scenario creates an uneven playing field for fish harvesters where the law applies differently to different stocks. This creates confusion and mistrust in annual fisheries processes and delays the full benefits of effectively managing healthy stocks. Their third recommendation, acquire accountability by DFO through an annual report to Parliament on the status and trends of all federally managed fish stocks. In most progressive fishing nations around the world, management authorities are required to report to their legislatures on the status of commercial fish stocks and the effectiveness of measures to conserve them. Notable examples are the United States, Australia, and the European Union. Canada is a global laggard in this area. Canadians, including the members of this committee, have no regular and systematic access to information about the status of all federally managed fish stocks, how management decisions have been made, and how scientific information and other forms of evidence have been used to support these decisions. And finally, we request that you authorize the minister when entering into co-management agreements with Indigenous governments to support the pairing of Indigenous knowledge systems and Western-based science and decision-making. This amendment would help advance the Government of Canada's action plan on UNDRIP, which includes a requirement to respect and include Indigenous knowledge systems. More detail on these amendments is available in our brief, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Elmsley. And with that, we'll go into our first round of questioning, the 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I welcome the witnesses. To Mr. McClinton, we've got a very comprehensive submission here from a group of ENGOs across Canada, many of whom receive a majority of their funding from the United States of America and individuals in that country. Would you say that groups like this having impact or influence on fisheries-related management decisions, does that amount to foreign interference in our fishing industry?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Small. Given my experience in working with the NGO community and now the ENGO community, both personally and what I've observed in other areas, I have found that some of the most effective ways to affect change is when industry and NGOs and governments work together. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity in the fisheries space for a greater collaboration in that area, and I'd like to see more of that so that we can come to ways to work together that actually make sense for the fishing industry. So I see a lot of opportunity there.
So we've got a recommendation from Oceana and others to modify Section 6.11 so that basically fish stocks won't be fished unless they're in the healthy zone, and only 35% are in the healthy zone based on the best fishery science. And many of our species haven't been properly assessed in 5, 6, 10 years. So where does that leave opportunity for people that you represent in terms of accessing growing fish stocks that haven't even been recognized that they're now in the healthy zone, or if you make an investment in a fishery that's in the healthy zone, all of a sudden it slips back into the lower zone, slips out of the healthy zone. What does that do to stability in your operations?
Well, I think there's two parts to that, and the first part, you hit the nail on the head. Right? When you just mentioned, if I understood you correctly, about a lack of science, a lack of core fishery science. So what I've heard many times from different quarters is that, if something is not in a, classified in a certain zone or things like that, what we need to do is what? Stop fishing. And what we really need is what I mentioned in my opening remarks is core fishery science. We don't have a lot of the information that we need in order to make healthy assessments. And I should maybe start by saying that our members are leaders in marine conservation and blue technology. Why is that? Because it's the right thing to do, but it's also their livelihoods entirely depend on that. So they're very active in that area. And then to your second point, Mr. Small, lack of predictability and stability is terrible, as it is in any business, right? If you don't know what's happening next, how can you invest in your employees? How can you invest in new technologies? So the more we have predictability and stability through stability of access and allocation and through core fishery science, the better it is for the industry and the communities that they support.
So I'll ask you this quite frankly. Do you consider closing a fishery as an appropriate rebuilding measure?
What I am hearing consistently from my members, and what I've seen consistently, is that the most effective way to help achieve our mutual objectives of a strong, healthy fishery and strong populations is through effective fisheries management.
Thank you. Has DFO done that after 10 years of this Liberal government, 7 fisheries ministers in that period of time? How effective has management been of our fisheries in the last 10 years?
I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to talk about the present and future. And what I will say is I've had, and our members have had great meetings with the current minister and with officials at DFO, as well as members of this committee, and we're optimistic.
I know you might not be here for that, but I'm asking you that question. Do you think that the fishery's been effectively managed, and do you see any considerable optimism going forward?
I'm optimistic based on the conversations that we've had, including with members of this committee, that our priorities have been heard, and I'm looking forward to working with you and with the current government.
So my next question to Ms. Elmsley is, I looked at your financials, and in 2024, 83% of your deferred funding came from the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation out of the United States. So what's the purpose of that funding? Is that funding your science program or whatnot?
That funds across our campaigns. But, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to make a point of clarification that for Oceana funding, and I can provide our full audited financial statements, 90% of our funding comes from Canadian foundations, including Donner, ECHO, RBC, Nikita, Power Corps, Mark Pathy, and Sitka. So we are staffed by Canadians, funded majority by Canadians.
So can you define, Ms. Elmley, define a campaign? What's a campaign to you? As it relates to your desire to change Section 6.11, What's your campaign? Can you describe your campaign against the livelihoods in our Atlantic Canadian fishery that are 35% in the healthy zone? Do you want the other 35% shut down, or using that money to campaign against livelihoods?
I want the other
Sorry, Ms. Elmsley, if you could just have a very brief response because we are over time here.
Yes, okay. I want the other 35% to be in the healthy zone too, or trending towards the healthy zone. If we get to a point where a fishery has to be closed or there's a moratorium, that is a management failure. That is not a good place to be in. So what we're looking for is clarity in 6.1, which is changing sustainability to healthy, and that would be in line with all of the existing DFO policy that is out there, that when stocks are approaching or in the critical or in the cautious zone approaching critical, that they should management measures should be put in place to trend them back up towards healthy. So there's more fish and more fishing.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Elmsley, if you'd like to submit anything else in writing after for this meeting, that will be considered as part of the study. But with that, we're moving on to our next questioner, Mr. Cormier. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci. Bonjour, Madame Chatillon.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Chatillon. Thank you for being with us. I presume you're coming to us live from Moncton. As the son of a fisher, I saw the fishery, and the lobster fishery in particular, evolve, change over recent years and become very lucrative. You said it yourself earlier. We do have reasons to ask questions about some statutes and regulations that seem very stringent, some arrests that have been made. You talked about 2 ways of improving all that. I'll begin with penalties. When offenses are committed, DFO publishes the names of the people involved and the kind of offense, and then we see the amount of the fine. Sometimes I'm surprised to see that someone fished lobster, fished females with eggs, or a large quantity of a different species, and then it's only a $200 fine. Do you believe that current fine amounts are sufficiently high to dissuade such people from going back the very next day to commit the same offense? Do you believe that penalties should be higher, fines should be higher, and that there should be more stringent penalties, like having people's permits withdrawn? Would that discourage offenses? Yes, thank you for the question. That's very relevant. There are 2 aspects of dissuasion, deterrence, as we've seen. The amount of the fine and its proportionality. Does the amount of the fine correspond to the seriousness of the offense? That is an exercise we can carry out with all species, but what seems to act as the best deterrent is the risk of getting caught. So it might be important to think about the consequences that play a role in the cost-benefit equation. So fines, yes. Targeted patrols, the fact of getting arrested, the fact of getting caught. These are measures that are not always necessarily criminal, but they can all work together. In your research and studies you have read, do you see enough people on the ground? Are there enough people on the ground, like fisheries officers, people from the RCMP? Are there enough resources on the ground, or should there be more? Fishing has become so lucrative, and you may be able to confirm this. What we're seeing is that we're seeing increasing organized crime in the fishery. So if I had to hold something up tomorrow, I wouldn't go rob a bank. I'd try to rob a fishing boat because they seem to carry a lot of money. So in your reading, in your research, have you heard of such things happening? Yes. I've read Canadian studies dating back to the 90s, which do detect traces of organized crime as well as violence towards fisheries officers. So this is nothing new. However, in recent years, the organized crime might have a greater place. So perhaps changes in the public and situations, contexts have led to a change in responsibilities. So it would be good to better define the roles and responsibilities of fisheries officers and provide an ethical framework for their authorities. Another thing I've seen is knowledge. Fisheries officers have a good knowledge of their region, specialized knowledge in conservation, but sometimes our CMP officers don't. They don't understand quite how the fishery works and how that might lead to explosive situations. It might actually hinder their ability to intervene. So perhaps clarification of roles, training would be useful. Delegating the situations that fall into the gray zone, perhaps being more clear in the Fisheries Act on who does what and who intervenes where, and direct some situations to one agency and not the other. Two brief questions. Is it easy for you to gain access to information on people who've been arrested? Is that present on DFO sites? Can you easily find the names of people and the penalties imposed on them? Is it updated weekly? Is it easy to find? No, it's actually very difficult to find. The information is fragmented. Only partial information is provided online. It doesn't cover a very long period. So the way in which the data are administered make it difficult for me to study. Another question, and it's a thorny one, but we need answers. Do you find that fisheries officers or the RCMP, when dealing with questions on indigenous fisheries, is there more resistance to arresting people from one group of people versus another when they commit offenses? Well, I've been asking and looking at that too as part of my studies because that can be measured and verified with data. Thank you, Mr. Cormier. Mr. Deschênes, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'll begin with a question for Ms. Elmsley from Oceana. Ms. Elmsley, earlier we had a discussion on Section 2.5 of the Fisheries Act, which states that in all her decisions, the minister has to consider a number of principles. And we believe, or some believe, that the minister should be obliged to take those considerations into account instead of it being discretionary. How do you see this? Do you believe the considerations in 2.5 should be mandatory?
We are looking at, now they must look at Indigenous knowledge systems. So I think clarity around what that means. How are you safeguarding that information? How are you getting that information? So that's less on, well, yes, we do think that the minister should be required to take that in, but also more clarity provided on what happens to that information once the minister has that information.
Merci, Madame la Ministre. Maintenant, des questions pour Madame.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Chadion, Ms. Chadion Farinacci. I'll continue on the line Mr. Cormier was exploring. In your view, what's the fundamental problem in applying the Fisheries Act in its current form in the fisheries industry? Well, there are quite a few. And the fact that roles and responsibilities of fisheries officers are not clearly defined and enforceable, I apologize for saying that word in English, leaves some gray areas. It allows situations to degenerate into criminal activity so that it can be handed over to the RCMP. So to deal with those gray zones, it would be useful to better define roles and responsibilities. Moreover, separation of powers. Perhaps the hierarchy should be re-examined. Who do fisheries officers report to? And could there be some influence from management? So fisheries officers should be protected from potential influence. And that might improve the relationship with communities who are likely to point out problems themselves. So fisheries officers perhaps don't have their roles and responsibilities clearly defined, although a number of provisions like 49 sets out the powers of fisheries officers. We can see what powers fishery officers have. What's missing? I don't think it's a question of adding powers, because in many ways they have fishery officers have more intrusive powers than RCMP officers. They can do things without a warrant in some cases. It's to clarify the circumstances in which those powers can be used. And when fishery officers take initiatives, perhaps it would depoliticize their actions by clarifying when they must intervene as opposed to when they may intervene. So you're saying that in spite of having their powers under the Act, fishery officers may not exercise them for political reasons? What do you mean by politicization? In recent years, I've introduced or presented my work to a number of fishery officers, and when I invited them to speak to me confidentially, most of them were terrified of their employers and of management. In my view, that's a sign telling me that the approach to applying the legislation may not be strictly neutral. It may be aligned with outside interests. What you've just said is extremely important. So fishery officers told you that they're terrified of their own superiors? Well, I don't have any names, and the names aren't important. No, but in the hierarchical structure, they are afraid of being penalized for exercising their powers. In some cases, this is what I was told. And in some cases, pressure was being exerted on them when it came to controlling the First Nations fishery, or is this across the board? I don't have details because, unfortunately, for the moment, I haven't been able to explore that aspect in my research. The aspect giving fishery officers' point of view precisely, so I can't say more. Well, but you talk to fishery officers, and they have legal powers to enforce regulations. And they're telling you that they're afraid of exercising their power because they might be penalized by the department for doing so. Well, I think this should be seen from the other side as well. Have I understood what you're saying, though? I don't have any details about who is slapping whose wrist. But you said they're terrified, so I'd like to understand what you're saying. Well, generally speaking, there is a fear, yes. There is a fear of the hierarchy, but I can't tell you what layer of the hierarchy is causing the fear. Thank you, Mr. Deschênes, and that completes our first round.
Almost a full, complete second round, but we'll start with Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll carry on with Ms. Farinacci. Do you feel that the current existing Fisheries Act and resultant regulations are sufficient for the effective enforcement and legal system to protect the resource and local economies?
Oui, je pense, il y a plusieurs éléments dans la loi.
Yes, there are a number of aspects and provisions in the current legislation. Powers are broad. But the question is on the situations in which power is exercised. Those are described in the legislation, as are the means used to exercise them. So at this point, there might be useful to have an assessment of the need for training and education that would help determine whether resources are indeed sufficient.
So the legislation and regulation is there, but it's uncertain whether it's being used as effectively as it should be. Is that correct? Is that what you're saying?
C'est bien ça, et c'est pour...
That's correct. And that's why I added it was important to properly define the roles and responsibilities of officers to more effectively protect the public and more effectively protect officers when they exercise their powers.
Thank you. Now I'll turn to Mr. McClinton, if I could. When the department, DFO, fails to deliver some of the core functions, such as catch monitoring and stock assessments, what are the impacts on your members?
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. So we need to prioritize core fisheries science. I think we're making a lot of this stuff more complicated than it needs to be. And I mean, we collectively, like Canada as a country, are making this more complicated than it needs to be. We talk about things like closures and precautionary approach and things like that. These things I think, are being discussed and these are backstops. It's when we don't have core fishery science to know what's happening that we wouldn't even need to go to that spot. So it is an absolute priority for us. We've had positive conversations with members of this committee and with the current government on that. We have to, as a country, prioritize core fisheries science. Lack of predictability, unnecessary closures are not good for business. Just like any business, not being able to do business is not good.
Okay, so how is the current act not doing that, or what would need to be changed? If we're reviewing the act and the core functions of the department that are basically in the act, what's not working?
The act is, now's not the time. Now's not the time to be reopening the act.
So the act currently provides the provisions that those core functions should be done, but they're not being done.
So what the current policies, regulations, and powers are in place to ensure stability of access and allocation, to prioritize core fishery science, and to partner with industry on marine conservation objectives, taking socioeconomic considerations into account. We can do all of those things now.
Okay. I've also just picked up on a few pieces of the act where the minister can basically take, I wouldn't call them emergency measures, but immediate measures to close fisheries in cases of stock concern. Do you feel that the appropriate pieces are in place to allow the minister to also make decisions on short-term if increased or unexpected abundance of stocks are returning?
I would actually invite, if I may, Mr. Arnold, my colleague, Mr. McMillan, to comment on that in terms of the immediacy of being able to be flexible based on new information, if I may.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Yeah, that's a very important topic. I can give you a black and white example of where the science has failed us. Some years ago, the Pacific salmon fishery had MSC certification. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Marine Stewardship Council and their work around the world certifying fisheries to the benefit of customers, heavily on the European and UK retailers. The market has spoken. These days, you must have the certification in a number of markets to be successful. Well, several years ago, our science was lacking, and the marine stewardship certification process is relentless. And the lack of science led us to have to abandon that certification. At the time, it was livable. Now, fast forward to today's environment, certification by somebody, not necessarily marine stewardship, but it needs to be sanctioned by the GSSI/UN, which is the Global Seafood Sustainability Initiative. Without that, we're locked out of markets.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arnold. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Clausen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. It's very obviously quite a balancing act between preserving the fisheries and the fish in the ocean and looking after the harvesters. So I'm going to turn to Ms. Elmsley and ask the same question that Mr. Small asked of Mr. McClinton. How effective would you say the fisheries management has been based on the Act as it reads today?
Thank you for that question. So in some, there's some bright spots. So I think the bright spot is the rebuilding plan, the 12 new rebuilding plans for stocks that are in the critical zone. That is a bright spot. That's where it's working. But the Act hasn't been fully implemented. So there's, approximately 200 stocks, commercial stocks that we have. Of those, the Act only applies to 30 of them. So they're batching them in slowly. It's a very slow process, and if it continues at the speed that it's already gone, we predict it would take about 16 years to fully batch and have the law apply to all of those stocks. So that is concerning to us. We're just coming out with our 9th fishery audit. So we do audit DFO on various, management measures, and I'm happy to, again, I'll provide the audit to this group so for everyone to see it when it's published. But over the 9 years, we haven't seen the numbers change all that much. So things have resorted a little bit, but we still have, only 1/3 of stocks that are healthy. 1/3 of our stocks are uncertain. So that gets to that science question. There's probably healthy stocks in there. We don't know. We haven't done the science. And then the other third both fit into the cautious and the critical zone. So those are the depleted stocks, critical being really depleted and cautious, there's a range. So we haven't seen that change yet that we would like to see, where we're seeing more stocks trending towards healthiness. We want to see more biomass in our oceans. We want to see more fish and more fishing. So really it comes down to the implementation and getting those stocks batched.
Thank you. And the science base that we're all wanting, both people looking at the conservation as well as the harvesters, how would you see improving the science that we can base these kind of scenarios on?
I think most simply it's the funding. Funding is needed for science.
Thank you. And Mr. McClinton, I would ask you the same question as well, because you also alluded to the improvement of science to be basing these questions on. How would you say that the science has been used to make these kind of decisions, and how would you see us improving that?
I would agree with my colleague, or the other witness here beside me, that it's about funding. It is about funding. And then, if I may comment additionally, it's about prioritizing core fishery science, because it's at the very core of the mandate of the department, but it's also at the very core of what the Fisheries Act is about and what the Government of Canada's role is, and it's of benefit to everybody and all parts of the system, right? Harvesters, the stocks, everything. We have to prioritize core fishery science.
Thank you. Oops. I have a question for Ms. Shadilon Farinacci. I hope I'm saying that correctly. The minister has often said and talked about rebuilding trust, and I noticed in your opening statement you used the same phrase, rebuilding trust, and policing approaches don't work. I've often been involved in some conflict situations, so I'm wondering how you would see us resolving these kind of issues, which are often, and I think you alluded to the gray zone as well. Is there room for compromise once we put the act, once you tighten up an act, is there still room left to compromise or to look at situations individually?
If you could just have a very brief answer, please.
Oui, moi, je suis optimiste.
I'm optimistic that in reviewing the Act, there would still be room to restore that confidence. It requires action. It requires dialogue with the industry as well as with coastal communities that could cooperate in reporting offenses.
Mr. Clausen, next we'll go to, on va aller avec Monsieur Deschênes pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Deschênes, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Ms. Shadillon-Farinacci, I'll come back to something I find very troubling in your testimony. I can't imagine a police officer telling me that he was hesitant to apply the law because public safety is pressuring him not to. So, given the circumstances, the Code of Ethics would be to protect fishery officers who might push back against political pressure, saying that the Code of Ethics obliges them to act in such and such a way. Well, it's the reverse. It could protect the public when an officer refuses to do his duty. In the RCMP's Code of Ethics, which is in the RCMP legislation, there's a list of grounds that require them to exercise their powers or to intervene. And there is something in there about failure to discharge your duty. So if there was a crime and the police refuses to act, there are grounds for complaint and disciplinary action. So it would protect both the officers and the public. When you met fishery officers, is this something that happens, or sometimes things are reported to a fishery officer who then doesn't do anything about it? Yes, situations of that kind were put before this committee in some access to information requests. There are tens and dozens of reports by fishery companies who see illegal fishing going on, and they condemn the very apparent inaction or lack of response. So how to explain no action was taken? Is there a directive to that effect? I can't say. All I can do is observe and document what actually happens. So you've observed cases where there are reports of what seems to be illegal action, and then officers don't intervene. Is it lack of means? Is it the fact that they don't feel free to act? An independent entity investigating ethical complaints could determine whether this came about through lack of resources or through poor use of discretionary power. This would be part of the terms of reference of the investigation. That's why a code of ethics would be required.
We'll go with 4 minutes, so I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Gunn for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Emsley, question for you. Do you believe it is legitimate or should be permitted for environment or other political activist groups to launch fundraising campaigns to shut down fundraising campaigns in the United States to shut down industries here in Canada?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
Do you think it is legitimate or should be permitted for environmental or other political activist groups to launch fundraising campaigns in the United States to shut down industries here in Canada?
I think, I think that it is, we're a global, world. These are global fisheries, global oceans, global environment. So I think that there are people that are looking at these issues. As far as Oceana, we have a Canadian board. We work in Canada. Most of our, as I said, 90% of our funding comes from Canada, and we don't campaign to shut down fisheries.
But you're not concerned at all about the influence of American money on environmental and other political activist groups here in Canada and the impact that American money could have on Canadian industry and Canadian jobs?
Well, what we're calling for is more fish and more fishing, specifically to Oceania, and to expand the fisheries. I mean, a fisheries collapse is a failure.
So you're not calling for closures at all anywhere?
If a stock is in the critical zone, we call for a rebuilding plan.
How
and that
about
rebuilding
marine planning areas or underwater parks? Do you support those?
Marine protected areas? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
we
you
do.
use whatever language you want, but those are effectively closures, are they not? And they could affect fisheries that aren't in the critical zone.
They're not closed to all fishing, it's to bottom contact, so there is
Well,
still
they're not
fishing
clear. They
there.
haven't specified what they're going to be close to. I mean, in my province of British Columbia, they're closing massive swaths of marine areas to different fisheries, including prawns, including trawl, and fisheries that aren't deemed critical in any way whatsoever and are being closed to reach an arbitrary 30 by 30 target, even though more than 30% of British Columbia's coast is already closed to fisheries. But to get back to my main point, you mentioned it's a global issue, so you don't think there's an issue with environmental groups here in Canada accepting money from the United States. Would you say the same thing for accepting money from China?
I haven't seen groups that have accepted money from China.
As a general principle. I mean, for myself, I think it's that we should be all in this together.
I think that there are groups in Canada, certainly, that give money to organizations in China. There is an exchange when people see problems in different parts of the world that they want to identify, and that's up to the organization of where they accept their money from. And to publicly report it. Where we accept our money, we publicly report everything. We're completely transparent in where our funds come from. So the important thing to me is the transparency of where the money comes from.
And you mentioned some foundations that you receive money from. Some of those foundations, I think you mentioned Donner, also have foundational arms in the United States. Can you confirm that the Canadian foundation arms don't receive money transferred from their U.S. counterparts in the United States before then giving them out to groups here in Canada?
Well, ours comes from Donner Canada Foundation. I don't know the inner workings of Donner.
So you can't confirm that Donner Canada doesn't get money from?
You would have to confirm with Donner how they're.
Because this is what happened when they tried to shut down the energy industry. Is Tides in the United States transferred money, huge amounts of American money, to Tides Canada, and then they dispersed it to a whole bunch of environmental groups, which then launched a well-funded campaign to shut down Canada's oil industry and keep Canada's fossil fuels and hydrocarbons in the ground. Do you view that as concerning at all?
So, Ms. Elmsley, we're over time here. Just a very brief response, and then we're going to go to our last questioner.
I would like to just to focus on Oceania and what we work on, which again is rebuilding of fisheries. You know, as we've seen using the model that we're talking about, the United States has rebuilt 50 of their fisheries and getting 50% more income. I would like to see that in Canada, and that is what we use our funding for.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunn. We're going to finish with Mr. Connors for 4 minutes.
Thank you. My first question is for Mr. McClinton. A lot of times we hear that the core science doesn't agree between fishermen or harvesters, Government of Canada, organizations like Oceania. Do you think that's a reality? And if it is, how do we fix that?
Thank you, Mr. Connors. What I have seen in my brief time now with the Fisheries Council of Canada is some of the most effective fisheries management decisions have been taken when the ministry has partnered with industry and taken industry science into account. I've seen a couple of examples of that. I believe one recently was with the Bay of Fundy herring, because our members do a lot of science, and I don't know that a lot of Canadians don't know this. I'm sure many of the people around this table know this. Industry funds a lot of the science that is undertaken by the department, right? Why? Because it's the right thing to do, but it's also, as I mentioned, it's their livelihoods depend upon good, sound science, and they also contribute in many instances to doing independent science. So the way I see it working best is when there's a partnership between industry and government, and when government takes industry science into account.
Thank you. Ms. Emsley, sometimes organizations like yourself are not seen as friends to the fishing industry. Can you give me some examples of how you've been friendly or how have you helped the industry?
Sure. You know, it is interesting because we do sit on different advisory boards and assessment boards, and I sit on the boards for North Atlantic right whale. And I have to say, there is so much positivity and collaboration in those rooms. It's one of those areas that I think that we work really well together with the fishing industry, is to find ways that fishing and right whales can coexist. We've been doing a lot of work on, advancing ropeless gear, and so that fishermen can access closed areas that are closed, so that they continue to fish and get their catch. So I think that is one of the areas. The other area is that, we put out in recommendations on different fish stocks that are there. We are transparent in that. We put that forward. I think our fishery audit, where we provide a comprehensive, transparent, overview of what's happening with Canada's fish stocks. We analyze all DFO data, is another way that we've been able to be helpful and supportive.
Okay, I think I got about 30 seconds, small one. Core fishery science, Mr. McClinton, how is there a way that can be improved from the government perspective?
Investment, what I mentioned earlier, and I think what there seems to be a lot of agreement that the funding needs to be there, and it needs to be prioritized as an absolute top priority of DFO and of the Government of Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connors. That completes our second panel. I do want to thank our witnesses for joining in person and early in the morning by video conference, and by video conference as well. Your testimonies will be very helpful for the study that we're working on and the recommendations that will flow from it. Our next meeting is going to be on Tuesday, October 28th, where we're going to continue the review of the Fisheries Act. And so with that completes business for today. Meeting adjourned.